Hello, and welcome to the Canadian Audit and Accountability Foundation's webinar on root cause analysis in audit. My name is Julien Reynaud. I'm a professional development officer at the Foundation. I'll be your moderator for today's webinar. We're thrilled to have over 300 people registered on today's webinar from coast to coast here in Canada, also from Australia, Fiji, Vietnam, Switzerland, Cayman Islands, Rwanda, Kenya, and other countries around the world. So thank you so much for participating. So I would imagine that everybody else is connected from their home in self-isolation during this pandemic. So are we. That means it's going to be a very relaxed and informal session. That said, we've still managed to look somewhat presentable by putting on a nice shirt. Before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to go over the structure of this webinar. Participants' phone lines have been automatically muted to eliminate background noise. To keep the webinar interactive, we'll be launching polling questions on several occasions. You're also invited to submit questions using the question box on your screen. These questions will not be visible to the audience. At the end of the presentation, we'll allow for about 10 to 15 minutes of questions and answers. Our presenter, John, will verbally respond to as many questions as time permits. So please don't wait until the end of the webinar to send in your questions. We will do our best to answer all the questions within the time permitted. If we don't get the chance, we'll post the answers to your questions on our website, along with the recording of this webinar. After the webinar, we'll be sending you a short survey for your valuable feedback. Since we've got several other webinars scheduled, your feedback will be invaluable to us. So that's it for housekeeping. So to cut to the chase and to talk about today's subject, we're joined by the Foundation CEO, John Reid. He's been involved in performance audit for about 24 years now, and he's very passionate about root cause analysis. So hello, John, and the floor is now yours.
Okay, thank you, Julian, and good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, wherever you are. Yeah, so here we are. I'd like to say thanks for joining us. I wish I could say I could see you all. Great to see you all, but I can't actually see you. I'm looking at a camera, which is quite weird for me. I'm accustomed to being in a classroom, but here we go anyways. So as auditors, you know, we've all been there. We've seen the headlines come and go, audit after audit, report after report. The headlines come and the headlines go. And even though we know that each audit stands alone, it's got its own story, its own findings, its own recommendations. When you step back and look for patterns across audits, common findings start to emerge. And they look like this. And I think some of these will be familiar to you. Certainly if you've been in the business for a long time like I have, these kind of findings really get repeated over and over again. And in fact, every time we run our training course on root cause analysis, we ask our participants for some of their common findings, and they have even a longer list than we can provide. But the question is, why? Why do these findings keep happening? Why aren't results achieved? Why aren't roles clear? Why aren't actions coordinated? You know, it's not rocket science. It doesn't seem to be rocket science to auditors, and yet these kind of problems persist. So that's what we're here to talk about today, and that's what the whole point of root cause analysis is about. So what is root cause analysis, and what are we talking about here? Well, first of all, root cause analysis is not a single methodology. We're actually talking about a suite of tools and techniques that are used in a variety of different settings. And all of these are there to try and they're an approach to understanding, why something happened, how a situation developed, whether it's an industrial accident, defective product, or some kind of program deficiency. And root cause analysis is also used for driving efficiencies in organizations, for eliminating waste, and generally improving business processes. But most of the techniques that are out there originated in the manufacturing environment. And so they use causes of categories of causes rather, that use words like machinery, equipment, materials, environment, manpower. And so we felt here at the foundation that these really didn't fit our world. They didn't fit the world of public administration, the parliamentary accountability system, and they didn't really fit so well with performance audit. So we embarked on a research project several years ago, leading to this paper that some of you may be familiar with. And this was a paper that we wrote in 2015, I believe. I was one of the authors of that work, done in a collaborative way with our members. And since the release of that report, that discussion paper, we have created a 2-day training course on root cause analysis, which is enormously popular inside our training environment. And very soon, we're going to be issuing our revision to the original discussion paper. So, what is the argument in favor of conducting root cause analysis? Why are we so passionate about this subject matter? Bottom line, I think, is that we believe root cause analysis is going to allow auditors to have more value in their audit work and ultimately to have more impactful audits. And we say that for a number of reasons. First of all, root cause analysis is going to improve the structure and the rigor of the analysis that you do when you're looking at your findings and the contributing factors there. And that is going to help you better explain what's going on, what was behind some of the significant findings, and that adds more depth and more richness to our reports. And even though we live in a world today where we're kind of headline focused and our communications are counted in the number of characters in a tweet, for example, the real important readers of audit reports really appreciate having that insight. And the other thing, I guess, is, as auditors, we don't exist to audit, we exist to have an impact. And if our goal is to have a lasting impact and to break that cycle of, the same findings over and over and over again, then the recommendations themselves need to lead to lasting solutions. And that's the key of the whole thing. And, if you look at a lot of recommendations, unfortunately, many of them state the obvious, fix the problem, or as a colleague of mine used to say, don't hit iceberg, or they treat the symptom. But if you do that, then you're not likely to have a lasting impact. So truly impactful recommendations are the ones that get to the heart of the problem. And that's what we're here to talk about. So today we're going to be looking at the audit process and how root cause analysis can fit into the audit process. We're going to be talking about main categories of possible causes of audit findings. Several techniques we're going to be looking at, 5 whys, some visualization techniques, and also we'll be talking about some of the risks that you have to think about. Now, this is going to be a real quick overview. I mean, put this into a 2-day training course so you can appreciate. I'm going to kind of flip through things pretty quickly. This is the infographic that we use on our discussion paper and our training course, and it kind of explains the overall approach that we have to the topic of root cause analysis. Up top, you see the tree, the foliage of the tree, and we chose the image of a tree deliberately. So up top is the departmental performance that we comment on and all the good things that go into our report. And then below the surface are our main categories of root causes, and I'll be talking about those in a minute. And on the sides are some of the techniques that you can use when you're doing your analysis. And different techniques have advantages and disadvantages that I'll be talking about. One thing to comment on though is if you look at that image, and I've got it on two screens here. If you look at that image, roots, and in real life, roots form a system. It's not a single root that comes down into the ground. Roots are connected and interdependent. And I'll come back to that theme in a minute, but just remember, roots are a connected system in real life. And in many ways, in public administration and in the world of audit, they're also connected. So we're going to talk about the audit process to start with. And this is, all of this information, by the way, is in the existing paper, discussion paper, and even more will be in the upcoming paper on the revision to our paper coming up soon. So let me start by talking about what we call the root cause mindset. And this is fundamental to our, and what we mean by a mindset, literally state of mind, always thinking about how did this situation happen? Why did this situation develop in the first place? Is it a symptom or cause?
John, can you please move your Bluetooth down a little bit? Your mic down to your, yep. Thank you.
Yeah. So, are we looking at a symptom or are we looking at a cause? And in our thinking, the root cause mindset applies to the entire process. And especially it starts in the planning phase of the audit when you're doing your early research, your information gathering, and the initial interviews. And it continues through examination, and it continues reporting and beyond. And the key is always to be thinking about affecting real change through recommendations that, as I've said from the beginning, address the real underlying cause of the deficiency or the finding that you're looking at. This slide speaks to the audit process. You'll find this in the discussion paper. Up on the top are sort of your standard phases and activities that happen in a performance or an internal audit. And underneath are the activities that we are proposing that you can integrate into the process. And that starts in the planning phase. And I think in most people's experience, during planning and certainly by the end of planning, you've already got a pretty good sense of some of the findings that might emerge. And that's a perfect time to start asking the question, okay, why? Why is this happening? Because you still have a chance to adjust your scope and your criteria and your lines of inquiry. And then halfway through maybe examination, another great time to do it, to test yourselves and make sure that if something you didn't anticipate is coming up, you've still got a chance to address it. And then even in the recommendation phase, it's another great opportunity to integrate that challenge into the process. So there are a couple of challenges associated with integrating into the root cause process. First of all, it isn't hardwired into most offices' methodology. When it is done, it's typically done toward the end of the examination phase when it's really too late to gather new evidence. It's also not required by standards, even if it's done commonly in some offices. And finally, it takes time. You know, it's hard enough to get an audit done at the best of times, but we recognize that this does mean you're doing things you weren't previously doing, and you have to take that into account in your planning. My headpiece keeps slipping out here. So we're going to now talk about the main categories of root causes. And in my mind, this is one of the more important and unique parts of the work that we did in our discussion paper and that we teach in our courses. And as I noted earlier, many of the techniques that are out there on root cause analysis come from the world of manufacturing. And so they use categories of causes that fit that environment: people, methods, machines, materials, environment, and so on. But we felt that these categories really didn't apply all that well to the world of public administration, and not really even to performance audit. So we came up with our own categories, as you can see on the slides here. And these include a mix of both governance-related categories and what we call operations-related categories. So these are the governance-related categories. And these, you know, in our terminology, governance relates to structures and systems and practices that an organization has in place to set its strategic direction, to oversee implementation of its work, and to measure and report on its own performance. And for each category, we have developed a list of possible causes. Now, this list is not exhaustive, it's just an indicative list. And I would encourage you and your offices to look at these lists and to add or to amend or subtract as you think makes sense for your jurisdiction. So this is the slide that shows our operations-related main categories. And operations, in this sense, refers more to the day-to-day activities of line delivery and functions and activities involved in delivering programs and services. And maybe it's a bit of a tired phrase, but you know, using these categories is a bit part art, part science. Lots of judgment is involved, and you need some flexibility. And I'd just like to talk about a couple of considerations when you're thinking about applying these, and these get combined with the techniques that I'm going to talk about in a minute. First of all, not all causes are going to apply to each audit. Secondly, causes are a little bit, findings and causes are a little bit exchangeable in the sense that in one audit, having you know, the right people at the right time and place could be a cause, but in another audit, it actually might be a finding, and the causes for that lie elsewhere. And even though we have put these boxes, these categories into kind of discrete boxes, in real life, they are interrelated, and you could mix and match a little bit if you had to. And the other thing to bear in mind too is that it's possible to have multiple contributing causes to any given finding. And so these two things combined, sort of the sense of being interrelated and having multiple causes, relates to what I said earlier about thinking about the real roots as a system, and how those in a real life system, you know, root as a system, and in the public administration, you can definitely have multiple and interrelated causes that interact with each other. And then the last thing I would say, and I think probably a lot of people have had this experience, in a public service and performance audit environment, sometimes the root cause can lead to areas that we don't normally go to, adequacy of resources, merits of policy, the absence of a strategy or legislation. And most of us know those are things that we typically don't comment on in our audit light. This is an interesting slide. The Office of the Auditor General of Alberta, sometime after we had published our discussion paper, set out to conduct a study of their own of, I think it was 100 performance audits, most of which were from their own jurisdiction, but from other jurisdictions as well. And they set out to do some mapping. They wanted to look at their own reports, causes and findings, and see how they related to our category. And this is the result that they had. So in other words, I'm not going to read all of this, but what this says, for example, is that of the 100 reports they looked at and the hundreds and hundreds of findings and causes contained in those reports, about 22% were related to authority. And you can see the other stats there. The other interesting thing, though, they asked themselves, you look at something like people being only 15% of the causes, and they asked themselves, is that really a true reflection of the fact that only 15% of causes relate to people? Or is it because we weren't looking hard enough or deliberately enough for those causes in the first place? And so on that note, I would sort of encourage you to think of these main categories, regardless of the technique that you use, as a bit of a checklist as you go through your, not just your audit planning, but also your analysis through the different phases in the audit. Recently, we have added culture as a main category of our suite of main causes. And as I'll talk in a minute, we've also published a research highlight on auditing organizational culture. And we put it at the center of this diagram deliberately because culture runs through everything else. Soft, intangible, nebulous, subjective, challenging. These are the kinds of words that just until a few years ago, auditors used to describe organizational culture. And auditing culture wasn't really considered to be appropriate or practical, let alone a priority. But things have changed a lot recently. Since the 2008 financial crisis, there were a lot of meltdowns and a succession of large corporate scandals that made organizational culture emerge as a recognized risk that has to be managed, monitored, and obviously for us, audited. And many people kind of talk about culture as the new imperative. So what is culture? So there's lots and lots of different definitions, and I'm not going to try and describe any of them. Most of us think of culture as an expression of an organization's rules, norms, values, behaviors, beliefs, and so on and so on. And that's all true. One way you can think about organizational culture is that it's made up of two complementary elements. What is said and what is done. What is said is the organization's vision, its mission, its values, codes of ethics, and so on and so on. And what is done are people's actual behaviors, the day-to-day practices, attitudes, and mindsets that underlie organizational life. Said another way, organizational culture is the way we do things around here. This is another piece of imagery that you can use when thinking about culture, and it helps to sort of separate the visible dimensions of culture, the stuff that's up above the waterline, the tip of the iceberg, and that's all the stated culture, and then below the waterline, the bottom of the iceberg, is the actual human culture that is experienced in the organization that's being audited. These are the causes that we have developed in relation to culture. And as I said earlier, it's not an exhaustive list. You could add to it or subtract to it yourself. But I'm hoping that a number of you out there are nodding your heads and starting to realize that, yeah, culture is something that is important to consider in looking at root causes. Recently, we have published a new research highlight authored by Pierre Frechette and Ida Wara here in Ottawa. And you can get that on our website. And the basic thesis is that organizational culture is a subject matter that's worthy of audit. And if you have any doubt whatsoever as to whether culture is relevant in our environment, I'm going to read to you a quote from Michael Ferguson, the former Auditor General of Canada, and what he had to say about the Phoenix pay system debacle in the federal government. And this is in his opening comments of the report, and it's, quote, "The culture has created an obedient public service that fears mistakes and risk. Its ability to convey hard truths has eroded, as has the willingness of senior levels, including ministers, to hear hard truths. This culture causes the incomprehensible failure it is trying to avoid." I think those words speak for themselves. So, Julian, I think we're going to turn ourselves to a polling question now. If you could take over for me.
Correct. Thanks, John. So yeah, we're about the halfway point here. I'm going to launch two sets of polling questions here. So this should be up on your screen now. So what are the two of the main categories of root cause? And we thought we'd have a little fun with this. So I'll give you a few moments to submit your answers, and I'll close the poll in a few seconds. Just over 50% of the participants have voted now. I'll give it another 20 seconds. Okay, so I'm going to close the poll. I'll share the results with you. John, can you see the results on your screen?
Yes, I can, and I can see that you guys were having a little fun in the era of COVID. Yeah, there's no correct answer here, but well, I guess I just finished talking about culture, so that's an obvious answer there. And yeah, so pretty good answers there.
Okay, so
now I think you got a second question. Well, I think you have a second question coming up. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'll launch the second poll here. What do you think are some of the techniques for doing root cause analysis? So this is a bit of an intro into the next section John is about to speak about. So I'll give you guys a moment to answer. We had a little bit of fun with this one too. You guys are much quicker at voting this time. That's good. Another 10 seconds, and we'll close off the poll. Okay, poll's closed. And here are the results. Five Whys and Fishbone.
Well, most of you nailed it. 5 Whys. We're going to talk about that. Fishbone diagram. Cause mapping is the other one that we're coming up. Sanitization is generally not a technique, but neither is social distancing, but you never know in the post-COVID era. Okay, I'm going to keep going, Julian, if that's okay.
Yep, back to you.
All right, thanks. So now we are going to talk about the 5 whys technique, which is one of the first techniques, and it's the one that we talk the most about in a way because it's very simple. And anyways, I'm going to talk about that. But all of the techniques that I'm about to talk about do build on both the root cause analysis mindset that I talked about and also the main categories of causes. So 5 whys is as simple as it sounds. The theory is if you ask the question why about a given cause 5 times, then, or a given problem rather, then by about the 5th answer, you will be at the root cause. Sometimes it's 4, sometimes it's 6, but that's the theory, and it's been tested many, many, many times. We like it a lot for a number of reasons. First of all, it's simple and easy to use. You don't need any software. There's no special tools. It's pretty intuitive. We grow up asking why questions. It's very adaptable, very flexible. You can apply it to any subject matter. It's scalable in the sense that you could do a 5 whys exercise around a very high level conclusion or a very detailed finding. And when you do it well, it really does support pattern analysis across your findings. And you can imagine that in any given audit, you've got dozens and dozens of findings, and sometimes the causes that underlie those contribute to several findings at the same time. It builds on professional judgment. That's why they pay us the big bucks. That's why that's what performance audit is all about. So it's an easy tool to use that way. I think it challenges team members because most of us are driven to have an impact. And you know, if you can get to the point in your audits where you're really nailing the cause and you're making recommendations that are going to lead to those lasting impacts that I talked about earlier, that's a pretty feel-good moment. And then the last thing is the 5 whys technique, or why questions generally can be combined with visualization techniques. This is a simple example of 5 whys that we use in the paper in our training courses. I'm not going to read the whole thing for you, but the message here is the finding is about the fleet of vehicles not meeting the availability target, and a recommendation that would be treating the symptom or stating the obvious would be as simple as saying, well, you're not meeting the targets, we recommend that you meet the targets. But when you go through the 5 whys here, and you can read the example, by the time we get to the 5th 5 why, the 5th why here, the real root cause is about succession planning and recruitment for technicians who work on the vehicles. And so the recommendation is focused on succession planning and the recruitment strategy so that the instructors are in place, so that the vehicles can be repaired, so that the vehicle fleet can be available to those who need it. And you could work your way through many, many examples like this and see how it leads you to a very different place. So there are some limitations about the 5 whys. I guess because it's intuitive, it's not repeatable. And what I mean by that is different auditors, a different group of auditors doing a 5 whys exercise on the same problem might result in a different conclusion as to what the cause was. And that's because it's intuitive and they're exercising judgment. Secondly, you know, the 5 whys doesn't really necessarily lend itself to multiple and interrelated causes, although there is a way you can work around that. It's pretty easy to stop at symptoms if you're not diligent in pushing yourself for those causes. It does not provide a structure, and I'll come back to that in a minute. And it's very susceptible to cognitive biases that we'll talk about at the very end. So this business of structure relates to the comment that I made earlier about the main categories and using those categories as a checklist. So when you combine a 5 whys technique with a structure like ours, then you're in a golden place, because without that structure, 5 whys can be all over the place. So that's it for 5 whys. I'm going to move on to another technique now called Fishbone Diagrams. And I think Fishbone Diagrams are probably well known to everybody. They've been around for a long, long time, used for product design, defect prevention, problem solving, and all kinds of different techniques. And as a visualization tool, it makes extensive use of why questions as well. And as you can, I'll show you now, typically the finding is on the right-hand side, the head of the fish, so to speak, and the spine, in our case, the spine is culture, and then you can see the different governance-related and operations-related categories in that. So that's kind of a generic template of what a fishbone diagram looks like using our main categories. And this is an example that's derived from an actual audit. I'm not going to read all of the details here. I'll let you look at that. But you can see here that the team here has been looking at a problem related to ambulances not responding to calls, emergency calls, on a timely basis. And in this case, the audit team has gone through each of these categories and identified some of the causes that could have contributed to that situation. I know this is rapid fire, but we wanted to get through as much material as we could and leave some time for questions as well. Another visualization technique is called cause mapping. You can Google cause mapping and you'll find tons of good references and explanations on how to use the technique. It too is grounded in the basics of a cause and effect relationship. What is the cause that created the effect or the problem that we're investigating? And this technique also makes use of why questions, obviously. And as mapping goes, you can layer in more and more causes, and you can see in this diagram how why is fundamental to that. And then this is the diagram that I think illustrates some of the differences between fishbone diagrams and cause mapping. Because as you get more and more into the analysis, cause mapping permits you to deal both with multiple causes that lead to a single effect and how they're interrelated. And again, this is the same information, same example on helicopters, and it's not been elaborated. But if you can imagine this in your mind with cause mapping, you can get more and more elaborate in the analysis there. And if you imagine for yourself for a minute, you flipped that diagram and made it vertical instead of horizontal. Again, I would make the comment about roots being a system, and as the base of that gets more and more elaborate, you start to see how multiple and interrelated causes can contribute and feed up to the problem. In this case, it's a horizontal demonstration, but I think it's still a relevant mapping. So just to recap before we move on then, main categories are the key driver for all of the techniques that we use. There are the 5 whys, the cause mapping, the fishbones, our visualizations. We talk about Pareto charts, which are another really, really interesting causal analysis tool. That's in our discussion paper and on our training course. Really, really good when you've got data to analyze. but we just didn't have time to go into that here, especially because we wanted to allow time for some discussion and questions from the audience. Lastly, I would like to talk about some of the risks associated with root cause analysis, and particularly the risks associated with cognitive biases. So generally speaking, I guess, separating causation from correlation can be quite a challenge. Correlation is relatively easy, but causal analysis and having the evidence for causal and for cause and effect relationship can be a challenge. And I think I said it when we talked about the process, but never forget that no matter what gets reported in your final audit report, even the causes have to have sufficient appropriate evidence. And that is another reason why they, again, start early in the root cause investigation in your audit process. If you wait until the very end in examination, you probably will have run out of time to get the evidence you need. So the more you plan it at the beginning, the better. And also, if you leave it too late, and this does happen, it's real life, you're in examination and you switch gears a little bit, you start pursuing a line of inquiry or an area of investigation. If you leave it too late, but it becomes a big part of the audit, then you might have to go back to the entity and make adjustments to the audit plan or the criteria or the objective. And then really the real point of all of this is about cognitive biases and the way they can impact not just root cause analysis, but also all types of performance audit. In fact, cognitive bias is now part of all of our training courses. We've become as passionate about those as we have in our work on root cause analysis, because these biases really do have the potential to create errors in our work. So what are we talking about when we talk about root cause analysis? Well, this is about brain science, and I can't pretend to understand it all. That's not my background, but biases in brain science, so these are all about the ordinary processes that we rely on to understand and navigate the world, to absorb data, to exercise judgment, and to make decisions in our daily lives. And there are hundreds of cognitive biases documented, and you can go to Wikipedia. I think Wikipedia has something like 130, and some of this can be pretty heavy stuff. This is the domain of psychology and human behavior. But we're only going to talk about a few of the ones that are most pertinent to the topic of root cause analysis and performance audit. And the interesting thing is, if I was to ask you folks, how many of you would consider yourself biased in your work, you'd probably say not at all, because auditors are by our nature, we're meant to be objective and neutral and unbiased in our work. But those aren't the kind of biases we're talking about. We're not talking about social biases. We're talking about brain science, and you cannot stop these things from happening. They're unconscious. In fact, that's another term for them sometimes. It's unconscious biases, and they're happening without you even knowing it. And the thing is, they make us vulnerable to certain kinds of predictable and systematic errors in our judgments and our decision making. And since performance audit itself and internal audit itself inherently involves making judgments and exercising decisions throughout every step of the process, planning, evidence collection, data analysis, managing relationships with our entities and people we encounter, reporting, and so on, auditors are vulnerable to a host of these biases, just like all humans are. In a way, it can be useful to think of cognitive biases as trying to solve four thinking problems that confront all of humanity. One of these problems is that we can't pay attention to everything. Our brains are swamped with information on a daily basis, and we simply can't pay attention to it all. So we filter. We pick out bits and information. Our brains pick out pieces and bits of information that it thinks are going to be useful for us. So for example, we tend to notice things that are already primed in our memory or that are unusual or surprising. And errors occur when we filter out information that's actually useful and important to us, or when we exaggerate the significance of the information that we focus on. Second problem is that we need to interpret information to make it meaningful to us. And what goes on is that we construct models in our minds of what we think the world is like. And we do that to give meaning to our experiences. And we use these models to fill in gaps when we don't have the information we need. So for example, we tend to interpret incomplete information using stereotypes. Think of that for a minute. We have a model, we construct a model about what a certain person or a situation is, and things fit into that model very readily. And the problem, of course, the errors occur when we imagine details, when we fill in details based on our assumptions and our default models, and we construct meaning that really isn't there. Third problem is we have to act quickly in the face of uncertainty, and this goes right back to our ancestral selves. Yeah, some decisions, we've got lots and lots of time to make those decisions, but many decisions need to be taken right away and in the face of uncertainty. And we use mental shortcuts, heuristics, to make these kind of snap judgments. And we make decisions most of the time that are just good enough. These are the impulsive, very quick, snappy decisions. And for example, we tend to favor immediate, relatable things right in front of us in making quick decisions instead of things that are delayed or distant or in the future. And so errors occur when we make really quick decisions and we end up missing some of the key information and the key elements that are needed there. And the last thing has to do a lot with memory. We simply can't remember everything. Our brains are highly, highly selective in what we choose to remember. And the memory is constantly making trade-offs between efficiency and usefulness. And so for example, we tend to discard details and we tend to form generalizations and impressions in our memories over time. And errors occur obviously when our judgments rely on memories that are unreliable or misleading. Now, all of that are general problems and apply to all cognitive biases. But cognitive biases are, I guess, particularly relevant to root cause analysis because humans have a predilection for causal thinking. We are, in fact, from birth, hardwired to look for patterns in experience and data. And this has been demonstrated again and again and again by people much smarter than I am about this subject matter. And one of the manifestations about this, pattern-seeking tendency we have is that we create causal narratives to make sense of our experiences. So literally, we construct a story of how a sequence of events linked by cause and effect result in or explain the outcome that we hope to understand. Now, problem with this, as Daniel Kahneman says, and Daniel Kahneman is one of the grandfathers of cognitive biases. If you want to read a really great book on this, check his book out, Thinking, Fast and Slow. But the problem is that, as Daniel Kahneman says, the human mind is a machine for jumping to conclusions. And that makes us exposed to making mistakes and evaluating the randomness of what are truly random events. In our paper and in our training courses, we talk about 4 particular biases that I'd recommend that you pay attention to. First is called the availability bias, and this is a mental shortcut that relies on immediate examples that come to a person's mind when evaluating a subject matter, the stuff that's available to us quite readily. Anchoring bias is about latching onto the first piece of information or data that we encounter in an inquiry, and we focus on it, and we start to ignore other evidence or other information that might conflict with this. Recency bias is almost the opposite of anchoring bias. Recency bias is about giving too much weight to the last piece of evidence that we encounter in our audit work. And confirmation bias, I'm sure, is one that's familiar to many, many people. Confirmation bias is essentially looking only for evidence that supports our theory of what the cause is, rather than searching for alternative theories that might disprove what we have in mind. And confirmation bias, I think in particular, is a risk for auditors, and it shows up in the planning phase. And don't know if you've been there, but certainly I've been there. At the end of the planning phase, we got a pretty good idea of what the findings are. The 80-20 rule applies, and most of the balance of the examination is about collecting the evidence to prove what we found in the planning phase. And we don't do that deliberately. This is what unconscious means. It's a well-studied phenomenon. So why do we talk about all of these? What can you do about it? If it's something that's happening and you don't even know it, what can you do about it? Well, you can be aware of it. And this is the most important part when you're doing your root cause analysis, and with your teams, with your colleagues. Make sure that you keep that front in mind of your the risks of falling into biases, and a number of debiasing strategies are available that you can use that we talk about in the discussion paper. So folks, I'm going to close there. This is just a reminder of the infographic that we have to describe our overall approach. I know this was a real quick tour. Sorry for that. We do have a couple of other webinars coming up. We've talked about organizational culture coming up. Those are the dates. And using artificial intelligence in audit coming up as well. So I'm going to close on that note. Hopefully you'll follow us, go to our website, get all that stuff. And Julian, hopefully we've got some time for some questions.
Yeah, we do. We've got a little bit of time for some questions, and we've received a few. So the first one's from Celia Young. The question is, do we need to have supporting evidence for the cause, or is the cause just an intuitive thoughts about what is causing the problem?
Absolutely. Yes. I mean, nothing changes in our audit standards. Sufficient, appropriate evidence has to be in place for everything that's in the audit report, including any causal analysis that you have in there. Not every office actually has a big distinction in the body of the report between a finding and a cause. Some do. Recently, there are some examples where there's a deliberate separation between the finding and the causes, but often it's just integrated within the body of the text and the narrative in the report. So absolutely, same rules for evidence apply.
Okay, another question here, wondering if you could cite a few other interesting examples of using causal analysis.
Well, probably lots of examples that come to mind. You mean other examples? I'm taking that to mean other audits where it might have been done. I can recall working with the audit office in Ontario on an audit they had done on long-term nursing homes several years ago. And we spent 2 days together doing causal analysis, literally the room mapped out with the findings and the 5 whys and the pattern analysis. Nova Scotia did a really good audit on the Blue Nose sailboat many years ago, and the problems they encountered in the restoration of the Blue Nose. So those are some examples that come to mind. I'm not sure if that's what you were looking for.
Thanks. Yeah, I think that's great. And just to mention to everybody on the line that these audits and many others can be found in the Audit News database, where which is updated monthly. We have thousands of audit reports and other types of documents. So you can visit our Audit News database to access some of these. We have one more question, and I think that's all we have time for. Are you aware of any other audit offices that have already integrated root cause analysis into their audit process? So this specifically about being in their audit manual or in the process.
Yeah, and this is hardly systematic coverage. So forgive me if I forget some organizations. I believe BC, the Office of the Auditor General in BC, had it built right into their analysis. Jessica Schaefer was part of our original group that developed the discussion paper, and I recall that they had templates for causal analysis in their methodology. I believe that OAG Alberta continues to lead on this. I recall they actually put it into their methodology, but also created an internal champion, somebody that became, the reference point and the knowledge center on root cause techniques. So, and Ruth in the OAG Alberta has been a big part of that, and I know that they continue to champion root cause work in theirs. Yeah, sorry if I've left anybody off, but I know of those two for sure.
Okay, thanks, John. So we do have several other questions. I don't think that we have, just being mindful of the time here.
No, we got 2 minutes. We got one.
Still good. Okay. Well, let's see here. Okay, here's a question. Would it be possible to determine the cause maybe by just using one why?
I suppose, sure. Yeah, I mean, there's nothing magic about 5 whys, other than it's been a tried and true method. I don't see why not, but yeah, I would. Yeah, I don't see why not, but it might not be the end of the story. But I guess if the 5 whys technique, even if you come up with the first cause, ask yourself, is there another why underlying that finding or that observation, and just test it.
Hey, here's another. Thanks, John. Here's another good one. How do you structure the audit report if multiple observations have common causes, which ultimately have the same recommendations?
Oh, that's a great question. I don't know how I would structure the report per se, but I would certainly find a way graphically to show that. I mean, it just sort of strikes me that it is something that you really could find a graphic, an infographic, for example, where you might have a cause in the center and how it is contributing to a number of observations or findings in the report. Maybe it's one of those convergent, divergent kind of things, but I think that's pretty intriguing. I think graphically might be the way I would tackle it myself.
Okay, thank you. So now I think we've run out of time. I'm just going to get myself back on camera here. So really, I just wanted to thank John, first of all, for your insightful presentation on root cause analysis and audits. I also really wanted to thank the audience for participating today. This really amazing attendance today. So that thank you so much. You can find a copy of the discussion paper on root cause analysis that John mentioned in the handout box. If you didn't get the chance to grab it, you can go on our website and download it there under discussion papers. As John mentioned, our next webinar is on auditing organizational culture. It will take place May 12th at the same time as today's webinar. And we look forward to seeing you at the next one. And we hope you all have a great afternoon, great day, and stay safe and stay healthy. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.